They told her she was property. They told her her only purpose was to obey. By sunrise, she fed the master's children. By nightfall, she slept on the floor. Exhausted, invisible, forgotten. She was a slave, raising the very children of the people who owned her. But as the years passed, something didn't add up. The way those children looked at her, the way they clung to her, the way the master avoided certain questions. And when the truth finally emerged, it rewrote everything history tried to bury. Before we go deeper, make sure you subscribe if you want more real human stories history tried to erase. If this story already has you thinking, like the video, it helps more than you know. And comment below, where are you watching from today? She woke before the sun, long before the house stirred, long before the children cried out for food or comfort. Her body learned the hours through pain rather than clocks. The floor was cold, the air sharp, her muscles already aching from the day before. She belonged to the household but owned nothing inside it, not even the rhythm of her sleep. By the time the master's children opened their eyes, she had already drawn water, stoked the fire, cleaned the night's mess, and prepared herself to disappear into usefulness because invisibility was survival. Her role was described as simple, yet it consumed every hour of her existence. She washed the children, dressed them, fed them, and carried them when their legs were tired. She taught them their first words and wiped their tears when they fell. When they were sick, she stayed awake through the night, pressing cool cloths to their skin, whispering calm she was never given herself. The house saw her as hands and feet, never as a heart, even though her heart was the thing being used the most. She was present for every milestone, yet forbidden from acknowledging them. First steps happened in front of her eyes, but praise went elsewhere. First laughter filled her ears, but credit was denied. When the children reached for her instinctively, she had to hesitate, always aware that affection could be mistaken for audacity. Love was allowed only if it looked like obedience. Too much tenderness could be punished, too little could be questioned. She lived constantly measured against expectations that shifted without warning. There were rules that were never written but always enforced. She could soothe a crying child but not hold them too long. She could discipline them but never assert authority. She could sacrifice her body and time but never claim emotional space. Her exhaustion was treated as natural, her pain as irrelevant. If she fell ill, the children still needed care. If she bled, the work still waited. Her own humanity was something she learned to compress until it took up almost no room. At night, when the house finally quieted, she returned to a corner that was not hers but assigned. Her hands were cracked, her back bent, her mind still running through the next day's needs. She had no privacy to grieve the life she never chose. Even her memories were dangerous because remembering freedom could break a person faster than forgetting it. She learned to carry silence the way others carried hope. The children grew, and her labor grew with them. Lessons, meals, laundry, discipline, comfort, endless repetition without recognition. Outsiders assumed she was fortunate to be indoors, away from the fields, but the house was its own kind of prison. Every smile had to be careful, every movement watched. Her body was constantly near the family but never part of it, close enough to serve, far enough to be denied. Her identity dissolved into function. She was not called by her name as often as she was summoned by need. Caregiver became her label, though it stripped away everything caregiving is meant to honor. She existed in a space where love was demanded but not returned, where responsibility was absolute, but protection was conditional, where raising the master's children meant giving them everything while being denied even the smallest piece of herself. The bond formed quietly, without permission, without planning, and without anyone naming it out loud. It grew in the spaces between commands and chores, in the moments when no one else was watching. When the children cried at night, it was her footsteps they listened for. When fear crept in from shadows or thunder, it was her presence that steadied their breath. She became the constant in a world that shifted around them, the one figure who never disappeared, no matter how chaotic the household became. The children learned her face before they learned the faces of their parents. Her voice became the sound of safety, the tone that meant hunger would end, pain would ease, and nightmares would fade. They reached for her without thinking, clutched her clothing, buried their faces into her body as if instinct recognized something deeper than role. She absorbed their fears and comforts while being taught that attachment was not hers to claim, even as it was demanded of her every day. Affection became complicated, dangerous even. When the children clung too tightly, eyes watched. When they preferred her presence, questions formed. She learned to regulate her warmth, to ration it carefully because too much closeness could be interpreted as defiance. Yet withholding comfort felt like cruelty to the children, who did not understand power or ownership, only need. She lived in constant tension, loving just enough to keep them whole while trying not to expose herself to punishment. The children spoke freely with her in ways they never did with others. They told her their fears, their dreams, their confusion about the world they were growing into. They asked questions she could not answer honestly. Why she slept somewhere else. Why she never left. Why her life seemed smaller. She carried their questions silently, knowing that truth was forbidden, and silence was the price of survival. As the children grew older, the bond did not fade. It shifted. What began as dependency turned into trust. They defended her in small ways, stood closer to her in rooms where she was expected to stand back. They noticed how differently she was treated, how her kindness was repaid with command rather than gratitude. Awareness crept in slowly, and with it discomfort, because affection collided with the reality they were being taught to accept. Others in the household noticed the closeness and named it incorrectly. They called it loyalty, training, usefulness. They refused to see the emotional exchange happening in plain sight. But emotion leaves traces. It lingered in the way the children searched for her approval, the way her mood affected theirs, the way separation unsettled them more than discipline ever did. What could not be acknowledged still shaped the household's rhythm. She carried the burden of that bond alone. Loving them meant constant risk. Not loving them was impossible. The attachment anchored her days, gave meaning to labor that would otherwise crush her spirit. It was a connection born in imbalance, sustained by necessity and sharpened by silence, a relationship that existed fully in feeling but was never allowed to exist in name. The master's behavior stood apart from the rest of the household, subtle enough to be dismissed but consistent enough to be noticed. He watched her more closely than the others, not with kindness, but with calculation. His instructions regarding her were unusually specific. She was not to be transferred, not to be sold, not to be disciplined publicly without his approval. In a system where control was enforced through cruelty, his restraint drew attention, even if no one dared question it openly. He appeared in rooms unexpectedly when she was present, his gaze lingering too long before moving on. When conflicts arose involving her, he intervened quickly, often silencing overseers or redirecting blame. This protection did not come from empathy. It came from something colder, something rooted in self-preservation. The same man who enforced suffering across the plantation showed an almost anxious interest in her continued presence, as though her removal would unravel something carefully concealed. At times, his authority hardened around her like a wall. He forbade certain conversations, restricted her interactions with outsiders, and ensured she remained within the household's inner orbit. The rules surrounding her existence shifted without explanation. What she could say one day became forbidden the next. What was acceptable behavior became suspicious overnight. The unpredictability kept her compliant, constantly uncertain of which version of him she would face. There were moments when his composure slipped. A child would speak too freely, or a visitor would make an observation that lingered too close to truth. In those moments his voice sharpened, his movements quickened, his attention snapping toward her as though she were both the cause and the solution to the problem. He corrected narratives swiftly, redirected discussions, and ensured that curiosity died before it could grow roots. His control extended to records, to names, to histories. Births were documented selectively. Lineage was framed deliberately. What could not be erased was obscured. What could not be denied was redefined. He understood the power of documentation in shaping reality, and he wielded it carefully. Paper became a shield, one that protected his status while sealing her silence even tighter. The household learned to read his cues. Others followed his lead, treating her with caution rather than cruelty, distance rather than violence. This difference did not grant her safety. It isolated her further. She became an unspoken exception, someone whose presence required careful handling. No one explained why. No one asked. The absence of explanation only deepened the sense that something dangerous lay beneath the surface. She understood enough to remain vigilant. His watchfulness was not concern, it was containment. She was kept close, not because she was valued, but because distance created risk. Every decision he made regarding her carried the weight of fear, not of loss. Fear of exposure, fear of questions that could not be answered, fear of a truth that refused to stay buried. As the children grew, the changes were gradual, but impossible to ignore. At first, it was only small details, the kind that could be dismissed if one chose not to look too closely. A certain curve of the cheek, a familiar shape in the eyes, a resemblance that surfaced unexpectedly in the light. People noticed but said nothing, because noticing required explanation, and explanation carried risk. Silence was easier than truth in a place built on denial. Whispers began among those who worked closest to the household. They spoke in fragments, never full sentences, never direct accusations. A glance exchanged here, a pause there, a comment cut short before it could finish forming. The children's features mirrored hers in ways that unsettled observers, especially as time passed and the similarities deepened rather than faded. The resemblance did not belong to coincidence, but coincidence was the safest word anyone could use. The children themselves were unaware at first. They lived inside the comfort of routine, trusting the roles they were taught to accept, yet even they sensed something unspoken. They noticed how often people stared, how conversations stopped when they entered rooms, how her presence shifted the mood of gatherings. Confusion settled in slowly, a feeling without language, a question without permission to be asked. Visitors to the household sometimes lingered longer than politeness required. Their eyes moved between the children and her, calculating, comparing. Some asked harmless questions that carried dangerous weight. Who taught them their manners? Who stayed with them when they were ill? Who they resembled as infants? Each question tightened the air, forcing quick answers that revealed nothing while trying to conceal everything. The children's appearance became a quiet source of tension. Clothing, posture, and instruction were used to reinforce distance, to remind everyone of the narrative they were expected to accept. Any physical similarity was reframed as imagination or coincidence. The household invested energy into reinforcing differences, as though repetition could overwrite reality. But the body remembers its origins, and resemblance resists erasure. She was aware of every look, every whisper. She learned to lower her eyes when attention lingered too long, to move out of rooms when comparisons formed. Her presence became both explanation and threat. Existing too visibly invited suspicion. Disappearing entirely was impossible. She carried the burden of recognition without acknowledgement, knowing that what others saw but refused to name lived inside her every moment. As years passed, the resemblance became undeniable to those willing to see. Time stripped away the softness of childhood and replaced it with sharper truths. Faces settled into forms that echoed hers more clearly, more stubbornly. What had once been dismissible grew louder with age, pressing against the boundaries of silence, challenging a system that depended on pretending blood did not speak. The reality of enslavement for women existed in a space deliberately left unnamed, even by those who enforced it. Their bodies were treated as extensions of property, subject to use without consent and without consequence. There was no language available to them that could turn violation into accusation. What happened behind closed doors was absorbed into routine, folded into the daily violence that defined their existence. Silence was not chosen. It was imposed, reinforced by punishment, isolation, and the constant reminder that resistance would only deepen suffering. Power shaped every interaction. Refusal was not an option because choice did not exist. Enslaved women were expected to submit not only to labor, but to domination that crossed every boundary of dignity. The system relied on their inability to testify, to name harm, or to claim protection. What was taken from them was never acknowledged as theft. It was framed as entitlement. The absence of accountability allowed abuse to repeat endlessly, each incident reinforcing the message that their bodies were never truly their own. Pregnancy carried a particular cruelty. It exposed what the system wanted hidden while simultaneously benefiting from it. Children born from coercion increased wealth, reinforced control, and complicated the lie of separation between enslaver and enslaved. Women were forced to carry these children under watchful eyes, their pain scrutinized, their bodies discussed as assets rather than lives. The contradiction was obvious, yet no one addressed it directly, because acknowledgement would unravel the moral fiction holding everything together. Motherhood under enslavement was stripped of its meaning. Women could give birth, but not claim their children. They were expected to nurture while denying attachment, to love without protection, to raise children who might later be sold, punished, or taught to see them as lesser. Every act of care carried the risk of loss. Every moment of bonding existed under the threat of separation. Grief was not a single event, but a condition that lingered constantly. The household depended on these women while denying them humanity. Their labor sustained families, yet their suffering was excluded from the definition of harm. Violence against them was normalized, dismissed, or reframed as discipline. Even other enslaved people learned to look away, not from lack of compassion, but from necessity. Survival required emotional narrowing. To acknowledge too much was to invite despair that could not be afforded. Records reflected this denial. Names were omitted, origins blurred, relationships misrepresented. Paper replaced truth with convenience. What could not be denied was buried under euphemism. What could not be erased was distorted. The official story was crafted carefully to protect those in power, while the lived experience of enslaved women remained undocumented, passed only through memory and whispered understanding. This unspoken reality shaped generations. It lived in family structures built on lies, in children raised within contradictions they could sense but not articulate, in women who carried history in their bodies without ever being allowed to tell it. The system depended on their silence, enforced it relentlessly, and benefited from it completely. The shift did not arrive with ceremony or warning. It emerged through a fracture, a moment when the carefully maintained silence failed to hold. It might have begun with a question asked too plainly, or a document discovered where it was never meant to be seen. Years of controlled narrative unraveled in an instant, not through violence, but through exposure. The truth surfaced quietly, yet its presence was unmistakable, altering the meaning of everything that came before it. A single detail carried more weight than intended, a name recorded inconsistently, a date that did not align, a resemblance too specific to dismiss. What had been managed through omission now demanded explanation. Those who had benefited from silence moved quickly, attempting to contain the damage, but the truth had already taken shape in the minds of those ready to see it. Once seen, it could not be unseen. The children were no longer children when awareness arrived. Time had given them the capacity to recognize contradiction, to sense when explanations were constructed rather than truthful. Pieces of memory aligned in ways that unsettled them. Moments once dismissed as insignificant gained clarity. The affection they had received, the protection she had been given, the tension surrounding her presence, all began to form a pattern that resisted denial. For her, the emergence of truth was not a relief. It was a reckoning she had been forced to prepare for her entire life. She had carried the knowledge in silence, managing it carefully, knowing that revelation could destroy what little stability existed. When the truth surfaced, it did not free her from fear. It shifted its shape. Exposure brought vulnerability rather than safety, uncertainty rather than justice. Those responsible responded with deflection. Confessions were partial, carefully worded, designed to admit only what could no longer be denied. Responsibility was minimized, reframed as circumstance rather than choice. The system that enabled the truth fought to preserve itself, even as its contradictions stood exposed. Acknowledgement came without accountability, recognition without repair. Relationships changed instantly. The roles everyone had accepted no longer fit. The children faced a reality that challenged their understanding of family, power, and identity. The woman who had raised them existed suddenly in two positions at once, neither fully acknowledged nor easily dismissed. The truth disrupted the emotional order of the household, introducing a tension that could not be resolved through silence alone. What emerged was not closure, but complexity. The truth did not correct the past. It illuminated its damage. It revealed how deeply deception had shaped lives, how long silence had protected injustice, and how fragile the structures built on denial truly were. The truth did not arrive as liberation. It arrived as disruption, unsettling every structure that had relied on silence to function. Those who expected relief found instead resistance. The revelation exposed what many preferred to keep buried, and the response was not justice, but damage control. Attention turned not toward repairing harm, but toward limiting fallout, preserving reputations, and restoring the illusion of order as quickly as possible. For her, the cost was immediate and irreversible. The fragile protections that had existed vanished under scrutiny. She was no longer quietly contained, she was a liability. Distance replaced proximity. Conversations stopped when she entered rooms. The same household that once depended on her labor now treated her presence as a reminder of failure, something to be managed or erased. Truth had made her more vulnerable, not less. The children bore a different weight. Knowledge fractured their sense of self, forcing them to confront origins shaped by coercion and concealment. They carried guilt they did not choose, tied to actions they did not commit yet could not escape. Affection became complicated by power. Memory became unstable, rewritten by awareness. They struggled to reconcile love with harm, connection with injustice, identity with shame. Public acknowledgement, when it came at all, was shallow. Words were offered without substance, regret without responsibility. No systems changed, no reparations followed. The truth was framed as unfortunate history rather than ongoing consequence.